What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Modern Hobbyist. Today I'm going to be giving a one-year review of my Anycubic i3 Mega and sharing some things to consider if you're looking into buying this printer as well. Let's get started. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Charlie with Modern Hobbyist. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to my channel and click that bell icon so you get notified every time I upload a new video. So for Christmas last year, my wife bought me my very first 3D printer, an Anycubic i3 Mega, which you've probably seen several times in my videos. I've been wanting to get into 3D printing for a while, but for some reason I couldn't actually bring myself to spend the money on one. That is, until we discovered the i3 Mega. I've had mine for just under a year now, and after countless hours of printing, several upgrades, many successes, and a few failures, I decided it's time to do a one-year in-depth review. In this video, I'll cover some of the pros and cons I've seen with this printer, some of the things you should consider when buying one, and my overall thoughts and experiences after having this thing for a year now. So without further ado, let's start with the pros. The first and potentially biggest pro for this printer is the extremely budget-friendly price. The base model of the i3 Mega delivers a big punch for such a low price tag, which seems to be a common trait among Anycubic's entire line of Mega 3D printers. The i3 Mega is the cheapest version of the Mega series, ringing up at $219 currently. On the other end of the spectrum is the Mega X, which at $399 is Anycubic's current flagship printer. In short, Anycubic has found a way to drastically lower the overall price tag associated with 3D printing, and they've still managed to deliver a pretty great product. While there are definitely downsides to lowering the cost of your 3D printer, I'm going to keep working my way through the pros and we'll address them later. The second best thing about the i3 Mega is the ease of assembly and use. This thing is so easy to assemble and set up, you can go from opening it on Christmas morning to printing Benchy in under 15 minutes. And I know that because, as embarrassing as it is to admit, I literally did that. With only 8 screws and 3 plugs to install, the i3 Mega is a great choice for beginners that don't want to struggle with a complex assembly process. Since the printer is made up of only 2 parts, you don't have to waste any time lining up your axes, tightening belts, or adjusting end stops before you can start printing. Anyways, next on the list of pros for this printer is the user interface. With a full-color, multi-language touchscreen, the user interface for this printer is incredibly easy to navigate and even easier to understand. Well-designed icons help to simplify the printer's controls, so even beginners like me at the time can figure out how to run this thing. The fourth pro that I want to mention is the wide array of materials that the i3 Mega can print. This thing can print all the main filaments, including PLA, ABS, HIPS, PETG, and wood with ease. While I primarily print with PLA, I've had tons of successes printing with the other filaments as well. The next feature I want to mention on the list of pros is the ability to resume a print after power loss. In the event that your printer loses power or is shut off, you can easily resume your print from the touchscreen and potentially save hours by not having to reprint from the beginning. While I have admittedly lost this feature by upgrading my firmware to the new Marlin 2.0, I definitely made use of it while I had it. In fact, when I was messing around with printing onto fabric, I actually found this feature incredibly useful. For example, if for some reason I accidentally moved the print bed while securing the fabric to it, I could simply shut the printer off and resume the print, at which point it would rehome all the axes and continue where it left off. Now, those are the main pros that make this printer a great option for beginner and experienced hobbyists alike, but there are a few more things worth mentioning. The thumb screws under the print bed make bed leveling super simple and convenient. The spare parts and tools the printer comes with have been incredibly helpful. The manual for this thing is actually incredibly well written, and there's a huge community online that has run into and fixed virtually every problem you could imagine with this printer, further backing up the idea that this is a great printer for beginners. And even though I didn't spend a lot of time talking about each of those points, they're definitely part of the reason I bought this printer, so I know they're worth mentioning. However, despite there being a fairly long list of pros for this printer, there are definitely some things to look out for if you're considering buying it. The first and definitely biggest con for this printer is the noise. Out of the box, this thing can create quite a racket. Between the cheap A4988 stepper motor drivers and the multiple cooling fans, I've clocked this thing between 60 and 70 decibels depending on the speed it's going. For me, this was the worst thing about this printer because I live in a loft-style apartment where the walls don't go all the way up to the ceiling. This made it super inconvenient for me to print because it was way too loud to print while we were sleeping, and I work from home, so if I had any important meetings that day, I had to make sure my prints were finished before I could start the meeting, otherwise I couldn't hear my coworkers. So in my apartment, I literally can't escape it, but if you can close the door and walk away from this printer, then the noise is no big deal. The next downside comes in direct contrast to the first pro I listed for this printer, the price. While having a low price option to get you invested in 3D printing is great, that low price comes at, well, a cost. To keep the price down, a sacrifice has to be made somewhere when selecting parts to build your printer with, and for the i3 Mega, that sacrifice came in several different key areas. First, like I already mentioned, the cheap cooling fans and stepper motor drivers make for one noisy printer. With a lower steps per revolution, the A4988 stepper motor drivers not only cause more noise and vibration to be produced by the stepper motors, but they also offer less precision than the more popular TMC 2209s. In much the same way, the cheaper fans provide less cooling and more noise than the higher quality alternatives, but in the end, the printer gets along just fine with the components it comes with. The last con I had related to the hardware is the fact that this printer has no MOSFETs to supply voltage to the heated bed and the hot end. MOSFETs are a type of transistor where the input voltage determines the conductivity of the device. In a 3D printer, MOSFETs are used to power the hotbed and the hot end to reduce the current demand on the motherboard. Instead of supplying current directly to the hotbed or the hot end, the motherboard simply tells the MOSFET how much power to supply. The motherboard's terminals are simply not rated for the amount of current required to power the hotbed, and as such you run the risk of melting those terminals or worse, catching fire. While I haven't heard of any i3 Megas catching fire, I didn't quite feel safe printing while I was away from home until I installed the MOSFETs. The installation was quick, relatively simple, and definitely worth the peace of mind that came with it. And on a somewhat related note, the next downside I've found with my printer specifically is that I often struggle to get the bed to reach above 90 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure if this was caused by the addition of the MOSFETs to my printer, as I didn't try printing with ABS prior to making the upgrade, but I do know that other i3 Mega owners have seemingly had no trouble at all reaching those temps, so it could just be my printer. While this is inconvenient, I still can print with ABS, I just have to be especially careful when leveling my bed to ensure that I get good bed adhesion on my first layer. Other than that, those are the only issues I've found so far with this printer related to hardware. The next con isn't so much a con, but more a missed opportunity. I'm talking, of course, about the firmware. The i3 Mega does actually run a version of the open source Marlin firmware, which is the most widely used firmware in the world for 3D printers and CNC type machines. However, it's a pretty outdated version of Marlin. So outdated, in fact, that I have opted to upgrade my printer to a version of Marlin 2.0. I covered this process in a video which I'll have linked in the description if you're interested in doing the same to your printer. The downside of switching, which I've already mentioned, is you lose the ability to resume after power loss. On the other hand, you gain amazing features such as mesh bed leveling, PID controlled heat bed, filament change feature, and thermal runaway protection. None of those features are necessary to operate your 3D printer, but it would be nice if Anycubic made the switch to Marlin 2.0 so we could have support for those out of the box. Speaking of support, the last complaint I have about this printer is that I can't seem to get a hold of the support team at Anycubic. I've tried several times to get assistance from them for various reasons, and all of my requests have gone unanswered. The only way I can seem to get a hold of them is by tagging them in an Instagram post, but even then it only resulted in a short inquiry about what I was working on, and that was the end of the conversation. I'm not sure if others have had as much trouble as me when it comes to getting a hold of Anycubic, but considering how well designed their website is, you'd think they'd have the support team to back it up. But in the end, Google is always your friend, and you can usually bet that someone has run into the same problems as you, and they've probably already found a way to solve it. Now, with all of the pros and cons out of the way, I wanted to take a minute to point out a few things you should consider when buying this printer. First, this printer is incredibly easy to get set up and started printing, so if you're new to 3D printing, the i3 Mega is a great first printer option for you. Furthermore, despite the low price tag, the i3 Mega still manages to pack quite a punch when it comes to auxiliary features, so whether you're buying your first printer or you're picking one to add to your farm, the i3 Mega will be a great, consistent choice every time. The next thing I wanted to mention, as neither a pro nor a con, is the fact that the i3 Mega has a Bowden type extruder. This means that there's a tube connecting the extruder to the hot end rather than having the extruder mounted directly adjacent to the hot end. I say this isn't a pro or a con because Bowden type extruders do help to reduce the weight of the print head, which can increase print quality in some cases, but they also have less control over retraction than a direct drive extruder does, so it'll be a little bit more difficult to reduce stringing in your parts. On top of that, Bowden tubes don't usually handle flexible filament very well, so if that's something you're interested in printing with, you might need to seek out a different printer. The last thing that I wanted to mention was that every single one of the cons I listed can be addressed with a little bit of tinkering. I don't want to go into too much detail in this video, but I've made several upgrades and modifications to my printer that have not only made it much quieter, but a little bit safer too. In short, I swapped out the stepper motor drivers with TMC 2209s, I replaced all the cooling fans aside from the part cooling fan with Noctua Premium silent ones, and I installed MOSFETs to power the heated elements. I have made a video covering all of these upgrades, so if you're interested in copying them, be sure to check the description for a link to it. Overall, this printer is a great option for beginners or experienced hobbyists alike. If it weren't for the low price of the i3 Mega, I wouldn't even have a YouTube channel to be sharing this video on. It made it possible for me to get into 3D printing, and for that, I'll always have a special place in my heart for the i3 Mega. Anyways, those are my thoughts on the Anycubic i3 Mega. I hope you guys found it helpful, and if you have any questions or suggestions, make sure to leave a comment down below and I'll try to get back to you. If you liked this video, help me to continue to make awesome projects by supporting me on Patreon at whatever level you can. Also, make sure to follow me on Instagram to stay up to date on the projects I'm working on, and smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of my future videos. Otherwise, that's all for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.